Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our AdMob Monetization Strategies webinar. A bit about myself. I'm Pranav. I've been with Google for roughly 5 years, most of that in the ad monetization space. I am a strategic partnerships manager based out of San Francisco. Before this, I used to be based in APAC and I've worked with publishers across the spectrum. I work with gaming partners, non gaming. I also used to lead the Firebase part and happy to share certain best practices and in general where the industry is heading from a monetization perspective today. So today in the current webinar we are going to talk about four different things. A, how exactly is the overall app landscape evolving and what does it really mean for you as an ad monetized publisher? How do you join the ranks of other successful app developers that we have? How could you use AdMob to monetize your app? And and apart from this, we'll share certain best practices and quick tips that might be helpful for you as you scale your ads business. So, starting off with the evolving ad landscape. So, first of all, as a lot of you would already know, we have two primary business models when it comes to the overall apps world. First part is in-app purchases, and the next part is ad monetization. Now, based on the statistics that we see across the board, on an average, roughly 5% of the users are happen to be purchasers for most of the apps, and this statistic holds true even for some of the largest publishers, which kind of means that 95% of the users that we have in our apps are essentially monetizing using ads. Now, the interesting part about ads is that a lot of companies, when they start off with one or more of these business models. But what we typically see in the market is that as publishers evolve, they migrate towards one. In fact, migrate towards a model where you have both of these things, where you have ad monetization and you also have in-app purchases. Interestingly, if you look across the market, you have business models in the OTT space, like Netflix or Amazon for that matter, who are now moving towards ads in their OTT offerings. So, even for some of the businesses that were traditionally IAP heavy, what we are seeing is that people are moving towards ad. And our current hypothesis is that eventually in the future, most of the publishers will be on this hybrid monetization spectrum where they have monetized part of their users through in-app purchases and rest of their user base through ads essentially. Now, one of the key solutions that Google offers to mobile app publishers who monetize using ads happens to be Google AdMob. I think some of you would have already heard of AdMob, but the idea today is to give you a 1,000 feet view of what AdMob is, what are the different capabilities that we offer for app publishers, and how can you use some of the solutions that we provide to monetize your app better. Now, as I mentioned, Google AdMob is essentially this one-stop shop and a single platform that would offer you all the different tools that you would need to manage your inventory inside your app. And when we use the word inventory, we essentially mean an ad slot or an ad space that exists inside your app. Google AdMob provides you access to different demand partners, Google being one of those, but you also have access to other demand sources through bidding and mediation, which you can add to your app. You have access to different ad formats, which we'll talk about in the webinar, that you can choose based on the exact app experience that you're providing to your users. And you also have access to different reporting and insights where you can essentially understand your ad monetization business in detail. Now, how AdMob works? Very simply, what you do is you integrate our SDK with your app, and through our SDK, you basically create an ad space. What you do is you allow different advertisers to bid on that specific ad space through ad mediation. And then through that bidding, when a user arrives on your app, they typically see an ad impression. And based on the ad impression, user demographics, so on and so forth, you end up earning revenue from AdMob every month, right? Now, how do we essentially help you monetize your app? So earlier, what I explained was the overall flow of how the monetization works, but we offer tools to help you achieve three specific goals. We give you tools to maximize your revenue from your existing user base. We make sure that we have engaging formats and the ads that you're receiving on your app are safe for the kind of experience that you want to provide. And then we also have reporting which is available for to help you get insights and deeper understanding about your overall business. Now, going back to our earlier point of purchasers versus non-purchasers, the question is, how do you monetize non-purchasers? And before I deep dive into the section and the slides, the in our experience, the single biggest thing that matters when it comes to the overall ad monetization is the actual app experience that you're providing to your users, because eventually your ad revenue is going to be proportional to the total time people spend on your app. Sure, you could decide to show them x number of ads in a certain time frame, but from a long term perspective, the more your engagement is and the more your app retention is, you will be in a better shape to monetize your existing user base. Now, broadly speaking, there are two specific things that most of the top developers do when it comes to ad monetization. One, they customize the ad experience according to the user they are targeting, and B, they try to build trust with the users, because eventually it's going to be some of these ad monetized users that will convert into folks who will make in-app purchases in your app. Now, talking a bit about the first part. So there are several ways for you to customize your ad experience, and the simplest of that happens to be offering people different ad formats depending on where they are in that app journey, depending on the app category you're in, and then also depending on the goals that you have for your specific business. And I'll give you a few examples. Imagine if you were to be a VPN app. What you would have is you would have people coming to your app for very frequently, but for every session, the duration or the amount of time they're going to spend on the app will be very limited. So in that case, you would want to show them an ad format that could monetize those short, quick interactions. And we have formats like App Open, which I'll share a little further, that could help you monetize that sort of experience. A similar dynamic could potentially be seen in a music app where, sure, people are using that app for, let's say, 30 minutes or an hour, but most of that time is spent in the background. So a user would only see an ad for a very brief period when they are actually on that screen. So in that case, you need to choose the ad formats accordingly. Alternatively, if you were to be a gaming publisher, rewarded is happens to be a common format. We do see folks in the non-gaming space also using rewarded. For example, if you're a photo and video app and you choose to apply your own branded watermark on the photos that people are editing off your app, you could allow people to remove that watermark through rewarded. So essentially, the idea is, depending on the experience that you want to provide to your users, depending on the countries where your users are based in, you could essentially choose the right ad format for your use case. Now, if you were to be a social media app, native happens to be a format which is quite prominent. Imagine if you were to have a feed, you could basically have native ads interleaving the post that you have in your feed, and then that would offer a more, let's say, custom and native experience to your overall user base. Now, apart from the four formats that I spoke of earlier, we have a couple of new ones as well. So first is App Open. It essentially I mean, sure, you could apply this ad format when an app is opening for the first time, but then App Resume is another use case where we typically see App Open being applied. You have full screen natives, which are essentially native ad formats that offer you some additional custom controls, and they occupy the full length and width of your mobile device at a certain point in time. We have adaptive manners that effectively expands to the width of the mobile device, just the aspect ratio accordingly. And then similarly, you have rewarded interstitials, which is kind of similar to a rewarded ad where people get a reward, but it's also similar to interstitial because it uh, pops up in between user interactions. Now, moving a little further, if you choose to use AdMob platform, you have access to all these different formats that you can choose according to whatever different experience you want to offer to your specific partners. And let's deep dive into one new format that we offered, and this happens to be full screen native. So as I mentioned, the beauty of native as an ad format is that you're allowed as a publisher to customize it whichever way you want. You could choose where you want to place the CTA button. You could choose where you want to place the logo. You could choose where you want to place the title and whatnot. In fact, we encourage and work closely with some of our top publishers to experiment with native ad designs to figure out what works best for their apps. But in this specific format, publishers are now able to offer full screen native experience where you can offer some custom controls. For example, if you were to have a video, you could customize some video playback controls. You could choose a custom aspect ratio for your ads. In fact, you could also choose if you want to, instead of someone clicking on an ad, you could choose an interaction where they're swiping that ad to dismiss it. And this is a common format that we see publishers applying in any dating slash social category that they have. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things which is, in fact, the key driving factor for your ad revenue is going to be how customized your overall experience is. And one of the many things that people try out is they would basically run an A B test with five different variants, let's say. And on one hand, you have your standard banner ad format, and on the other hand, you have four different native styles. And when you run an A B test, you would effectively figure out over an extended period of time which of those ad formats are performing best for which part of your inventory. And when I talk about customization, we can go into a lot of details. And at end of the slide, we'll share a link where you can book specific consultations. And in those, we can help discuss specifics of your app. But essentially, the idea of native is that uh, you could totally customize that experience based on which part of your app you have applied this to. If you were to be a dating app, you could probably approach it differently. If you were to have a feed inside a dating app, you could still approach native differently. And we have seen publishers getting a lot of success when they choose to run some of these data driven experimentations and then eventually come up with the right format or the right experience that works for their existing application, right? Now, moving on, as I mentioned, we do have some new ad formats, for example, App Open. And some of the best practices of App Open happen to be that you could certainly target people in emerging markets. You could target potentially users who are unlikely to pay in. Who are unlikely to pay for your app, and you could also hide your ads for new all people who are coming to your app for the first time. And to give you an example, if you look at the screenshot on the right, a user clicks on this ad, it opens up, you see the initial landing screen, and this that is after that you typically see an app open ad. So the thing about app open ad is that it is only going to occupy 85% of your screen, and on the top of the ad you would have your own branding where publishers will be able to continue to your app. So it's kind of a mix between an interstitial, but the thing with app open is it's really unlocking net new inventory, because one of the criterias for interstitials is that it has to lie between two screens. That's not the case with app open. So I would encourage all of you to try out app open as an ad format, because this is really going to unlock net new inventory and interactions that you may not have. And while, as I mentioned earlier, while the name says app open, I would also encourage that you try this out on app resume. When a user hasn't really closed your app entirely, but they basically put that into background and they come back to it as and when needed. This is a behavior that we see very commonly, as I mentioned earlier, in the music space, in the VPN space. We also see this happening in the social space, messaging space, where people are really shuttling between apps and interactions. And that's basically what you could choose to monetize using this format, right? Now, the other format that we have is rewarded interstitials. So it's called rewarded because it essentially is a form of it's an incentivized ad format where a user would effectively click on an ad because there is a certain reward that they're going to get out after they complete an ad. But it's kind of similar to an interstitial because you have more flexibility in terms of when this ad appears, and it is still an opt-in. But unlike rewarded, this won't be an explicit opt-in before an ad pops up. User would get an option to dismiss this ad if they choose not to go through this. But unlike a rewarded ad, this is something which will allow you to control where this ad should appear a little more. Now, moving on, this ad format is not exactly new because this has been there for a while, and we call this adaptive banner. So, if you look at the screenshot on the left, what you have is in a typical banner ad, you have a fixed width, which is put out in your mobile device, right? Even on the left hand side, you have a standard anchored banner, which is a banner ad format that either sticks to the top or bottom of your app, or you have an inline banner which kind of lies between the content that you have inside your app, right? On the right hand side, you have some the same experience, but through an adaptive ad format. And the thing about adaptive banner is that it will basically adapt to the size of the mobile device that you have. Something which will be super useful if you're choosing to monetize your users through Android as a platform, because in Android we see heavy device fragmentation and there are all sorts of different sizes, different operating systems, and whatnot. And that is where a format like this becomes super helpful, because it will dynamically adapt the advertisement to the mobile device. And what it will do is it will basically expand the ad to fill up the overall width of the mobile device, and it is going to then change the aspect ratio accordingly. So in that case, the ad could be slightly larger in terms of height, but it's often not a lot, because there is only a minor space adjustment that is happening in the width and a corresponding adjustment in aspect ratio that's happening on the height of it. Now, in terms of monetization, one of the good ways and one of the interesting frameworks to think about that is to see what features in your app are used by what fraction of people. So basically, you could put those things on a spectrum where you have features which are used by many people, and then you could have features which are used by some people or some a small fraction of your user base. Alternatively, your app could offer certain essential features and your app could offer certain optional features, right? So, for example, if you're, let's say, a social media app, maybe clicking up a picture is an optional feature because the key idea is sharing it, right? But being able to reach out to your network through personal messages would be an essential feature in that case. Now, if you overlay these two axes together, you would basically see that you could divide your overall user base into four different parts, or through based on the feature usage. You could have people who are using an essential, you could have an essential feature which is used by many people. You could have a feature which is used by many people but is optional, and similarly you would have other two buckets. And for the top right, which is basically an essential feature which is used by many people, you might want to carefully integrate that monetization. As an example, if you were to have a social media app and a social media feed, which is the primary feature that is used by many people, in that case maybe you want to place a native ad. Now, if you have a feature which is used by many people, but it is optional, that often indicates that people want that thing and they really are using it in whatever shape or capacity. And in those cases, you could, let's say, choose rewarded ads to monetize those, right? And similarly, you could have opt in monetization for things which are essential but are probably used by few people, so on and so forth. Now, this is just one of the many frameworks that you use. At the end, what works best for your app clearly depends on the data that you have. And typically, one of the approach that we take is we would look at your overall engagement time and the session numbers, and then decide bottoms up what sort of an ad experience we want to provide to our users. Let's say we could decide that in, let's say, 5 minutes, we want to show people two interstitial ads, and then we can customize the overall ad experience according to that. Now, this kind of is an interesting segue into the next topic, which happens to be ad density. And when we say ad density, we really mean the total amount of ad impressions that you're showing to a user base. We strongly encourage all the developers to keep track of this metric. If you're using AdMob, there is a report called as user activity report. I would encourage you to explore that further, because it will give you some of these metrics for your applications that you're monetizing through AdMob that you should be able to look at. And once you look at your impression per user numbers for specific ad formats, you would come across a lot of interesting statistics. A lot of times people feel that, let's say, I'm showing 5 or 6 impressions per user for my app. But when they dig further into it, they would realize most of those impressions are really coming from banner ad formats, and hence they are not making as much money as you would want. And we often have publishers trying out replacing these formats with one another. So theoretically, you could do a test where you could effectively replace one or more of those banner impressions with an interstitial impressions and see the impact of that change on your overall ad density numbers, obviously, but your overall revenue. So in this specific case, you might end up reducing your ad density a little bit, but you would effectively end up making more revenue. Now, this is just one part of the equation, but more often than not, we do see people uh, under monetizing a large fraction of their user base. So if you open that user activity report, there is this thing called as daily ad viewers, which will show you in absolute numbers the total number of users that come to your app in a single day who have not viewed an app, or who have viewed an app, which you could subtract out of your daily active users to figure out users who have not seen any ads. So very often you could have a situation where you would see that only 60% or 60% of your user base is seeing any ad whatsoever, which means there is something with that 40% that they're not seeing anything. Now, if you look at your overall ad density numbers, it might still look fine, but if you divide your ad density numbers based on these two segments, you could see that people who are seeing ads are probably seeing a lot of those, but on an average, you don't have such high ad density. So in those cases, we typically recommend publishers to spread their overall ad impressions to a larger user base and then rationalize both those numbers independently. Now, why we would have some fraction of your users not seeing any ads, it entirely depends on the type of ad experience that you're providing. It probably could depend on the implementation. There could be certain structural challenges with certain markets. For example, you could have a scenario where people don't have internet, or your app, it's possible to use your app offline. In those cases, we would typically see a lot of offline usage and people not seeing any ads. So we would encourage you to use Firebase or any other ad analytic or any other analytic solution, implement those events and really try to figure out what's happening with that segment of user base which is not seeing any advertisement. Now, moving on, as I mentioned earlier, one of the two key pillars of your overall ad monetization experience, A is customizing your overall experience, and B is that you want to build trust with your user base. And how you do that is to two things. A, you offer people contextually relevant ads that are helpful. So we would encourage you to be very thoughtful about where you're placing those ads. More often than not, people end up putting ads at all sorts of places, and in our experience that is often counterproductive. We would strongly encourage you to think about what would be the most natural interaction, or what would be the most natural place for a user to be able to find that advertisement, and then place your ads accordingly. And once you follow that approach, you would see a higher engagement, higher retention, which, as I mentioned earlier, happens to be the backbone of your overall monetization strategy. Now, one of the other parts about building trust is that we offer ads that are high quality and that are safe for your specific users. So, AdMob does provide you with a bunch of different tools where you can ensure that you have high quality supply of ads which are coming to your app. And some of those things are, you have your apps.txt. You could you do have ad inspector tools which will allow you to look at specific ad impressions. You have ad review center where you could basically see what ads were displayed on your mobile, on your app. In that center, you also have places where you could see what advertiser segments form what fraction of your overall impressions, and often that's an interesting statistic to look at. And if you go to that part of your app, you'll be able to see that, oh, 18% of my advertisement was coming from advertisers in the computers and peripheral category, or let's say 14% was coming from, let's say, retail. So it's an interesting number for you to be able to explore. Now, moving on, in terms of how do you leverage AdMob and what are some of the best practices that we see. So we have some of the top app publishers across the world, both gaming and non-gaming, which are using AdMob to monetize through their apps. And one of the examples is Metal. It's a gaming publisher which monetizes through AdMob. And once they started using AdMob bidding and AdMob waterfall mediation, they saw a roughly 12% increase in their overall ads revenue. We also have this app called as Duolingo. Duolingo happens to be an educational app, which it's an educational language learning application, which has kind of a very good gamified experience for language learning. It will offer you these different streaks and different uh, tests that you could undertake every day to make sure that you're progressing through those language learning lessons. And Duolingo also works very closely with our team. They monetize through Google AdMob, and they did see a significant increase there in their overall ad revenue after moving to AdMob based ads. Now, while we are on Duolingo, one of the key points that I want to drive here is that irrespective of the ad experience, what again matters is the overall app experience that you provide and how thoughtfully you take your users through the overall experience that you're providing. Having said that, every app and every genre and every category would have their own structural constraints. For example, the time that people will spend on the app, how often will they come back to it, so on and so forth. So that is something you might want to keep in mind when you're deciding on the specific ad formats versus the ad density, so on and so forth. Now, some super quick tips and best practices in terms of what you should be doing when you're starting off your AdMob monetization journey. We would encourage you to test your apps through the test mode and demo ad units that we have. We would You should certainly play with different CPM floors for different ad units and different pieces of inventory. AdMob allows you to apply country specific floors. For example, if you want to have a special floor for, let's say, Australia, you could do that for any part of your ad unit. uh, you should typically consider you're talking about ads, you should consider your app to be a collection of different segments of inventory, and you should be able to decide and experiment with how you want to monetize different sections of that inventory. It's very similar to, let's say, a retailer who chooses to market their products in different parts of the world. So depending on who's coming to your app, the country they're from, you could totally see very different and in fact widely different ECPMs. So you should certainly play around with those floors. We also offer you tools to cap the number of impressions that you would show to a user. Those tools are typically available at an ad unit level. So let's say if you have a certain interstitial ad unit for your users, you should totally play around with the overall ad frequency if you want to show that to your users once, twice, 10 times, or whatever number that you decide. And then uh, one of the things that enables all this experimentation and insights and reporting is Firebase. So we would also encourage you to link it through Firebase, or rather choose any other product analytics solution that you have to make sure that you have these numbers handy with you before you choose to go ahead with any form of experimentation. Now, in terms of policies and uh, the general guardrails. So the general rule of thumb is you should always put your users first, because they are the ones who will eventually be coming to your app, using it, talking about it, giving your reviews. A lot of people end up making this mistake. Do not click on your own ads when you're testing an ad. When you're testing an ad, you should strictly use test ads, test devices, and make sure that you debug them on your own. Don't explicitly click on those ads. The next step is you should ideally understand your ad traffic and your app users. Partly Firebase is going to be helpful here, partly we have all these insights tools that you have access to in AdMob. Feel free to go through those. You'll know which are the top advertisers that you have, which are the top ad networks that you have, what countries your users are coming from. So feel free to look at those data cards. And then you should certainly avoid partnering with untrusted and low quality ad networks, seem to give you a revenue boost in short term, but in long term they would offer you a subpar experience when it comes to the overall ad quality. I think we are very close to end of our webinar. So in terms of next steps, few things: you can sign up for AdMob through this QR code on the right. You could always request a specific AdMob consultation where you'll have your team reaching out to you through this link, your email for helpful resources and whatnot. And then we have certain YouTube links out here, which you can uh, go through, experiment with, and see other content that we have for AdMob. So this is all that we had. I think our team will be reaching out to you with rest of the details and probably these slides too. Looking forward to working closely with you, and feel free to reach out if you have any more questions. Thank you.